bienvenue à tous pour cette conférence assez extraordinaire, puisque c'est la conférence facultaire en l'honneur de notre docteur honoris causa, qui recevra le doctorat honoris causa demain. Donc je vais un peu vous la présenter pour ceux qui ne la connaissent pas. Je switcherai en anglais à la fin de l'éloge, avant de lui céder la parole, bien évidemment. Avant ça, je souhaiterais excuser la rectrice qui malheureusement ne peut pas se joindre à nous finalement, mais qui sera bien évidemment là demain, donc vous pourrez retrouver demain, bien entendu. Alors, Naomi Oreskes, que nous allons fêter après l'avoir écoutée aujourd'hui, est formée en tant que géologue à l'Imperial College London et à la Stanford University. Elle est aujourd'hui professeure d'histoire des sciences à l'université de Harvard. C'est une spécialiste internationalement reconnue des questions qui portent sur le rôle des sciences dans l'évolution des débats de société, et tout particulièrement sur des questions environnementales et climatiques. Elle se passionne pendant sa première carrière académique, en tant que géologue, donc à ce moment-là, pour des enjeux et méthodes scientifiques dans le traitement des questions de doute et d'incertitude, on reparlera sans doute de ces mots-là, et en s'intéressant notamment à l'histoire des savoirs concernant les plaques tectoniques. On est donc bien là en géologie. En 1998, elle est nommée professeure d'histoire des sciences à l'University of California à San Diego, et elle concentre à ce moment-là ses travaux sur les processus de construction de consensus dans les sciences climatiques. Et elle démontre ainsi scientifiquement l'énorme consensus qui régnait dans les sciences climatiques sur l'origine anthropique de l'effet de serre. En 2010, elle publie avec Eric Conway The Merchants of Doubt, que plusieurs d'entre vous ont sans doute lu. Et dans ce livre qui a été extrêmement remarqué par les scientifiques de toutes disciplines impliquées dans l'étude des changements climatiques, évidemment, il montre à deux comment la réalité scientifique établie des réchauffements climatiques anthropiques a pourtant été activement discréditée par les lobbyistes industriels et politiques. Naomi Oreskes et Eric Conway documentent avec précision comment les arguments construits par les lobbyistes et portés vers les scientifiques climato-sceptiques, ben oui, il y en avait encore, arrivent à instaurer le doute dans la société civile et politique quant à l'origine et à l'ampleur des changements climatiques. Ils ont aussi montré que ces mêmes registres d'instauration de doute ont été éprouvés déjà dans d'autres débats publics historiques, autour du tabagisme d'abord, des pluies acides, ou encore du trou dans la couche d'ozone, par exemple. Loin d'être anodin dans une décennie qui a vu réémerger des relents de non-scientificité qu'on aurait cru laisser derrière nous, Naomi Oreskes a fortement contribué à mieux comprendre les registres et les processus qui amènent à des formules de dépolitisation, voire de décrédibilisation des sciences, tout simplement. Elle rejoint en 2013 le département d'histoire des sciences de Harvard University et depuis, elle poursuit sa quête de l'analyse des interactions entre sciences, société, politique et économie. Elle a produit un grand nombre d'écrits de vulgarisation, des pièces d'opinion aussi, dont le très fascinant livre de prospective rétroactive, The Collapse of Western Civilization, A View from the Future, de nouveau avec Eric Conway en 2014 cette fois, qui développe une vue sur le grand effondrement de 2093, vu depuis l'année 2393. Elle a publié 9 livres, plus de 150 articles scientifiques. Elle a obtenu de très nombreuses récompenses et le prix pour son parcours et ses travaux, dont une prestigieuse médaille de la British Academy, le prix Mary Rabbit de la Geological Society of America. Elle est fellow, entre autres choses, de la American Association for the Advancement of Science et de la American Academy of Arts and Science. Par son parcours interdisciplinaire inédit qui navigue entre les sciences sociales et les sciences naturelles, par son engagement personnel et scientifique dans la lutte contre l'obscurantisme dans les sciences et pour des politiques climatiques et environnementales ambitieuses, par son positionnement ferme dans une lecture genrée de l'avancement des sciences, par ses prises de risques aussi dans les processus scientifiques et sociétaux difficiles, notamment aux USA sous l'ère Trump, il lui est arrivé quelques petites choses, par sa capacité à développer une recherche collaborative et respectueuse des diversités, La professeure Naomi Oreskes représente de façon exemplaire un parcours de chercheuse dévouée à l'avancement des connaissances, des dynamiques socio-écologiques et à la traduction de ces connaissances scientifiques en actions sociopolitiques. Elle contribue très activement à façonner un monde plus juste et plus durable. In short, Naomi Oreskes is a committed researcher, a strong voice in support of science, an outstanding analyst, and a courageous woman. If tomorrow Naomi will be officially honored with the title of Dr. Honoris Causa, it's today that we are honored by your presence. So thank you very, very, very much to be here, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much for that generous introduction. It is an honor and a pleasure to be here with you today, and I thank you for your patience in listening to me in English, because while I can't understand French, I can't really speak it. So I want to talk to you today about a central question that has really informed much of my work for the past 20 years, which is the simple question, why don't we act on what we know? I was trained as a natural scientist, as you just heard, as a geologist, and I was trained to believe, as I think virtually all scientists are, what Francis Bacon said 4 centuries ago, that knowledge is power. But in recent decades, we have seen the many ways in which this has proven not to be so true. By the mid-1990s, it was well established that greenhouse-driven warming was underway. In 1995, the IPCC, as you all know, in its second assessment report declared that human activity was underway. And this is a map from NASA in 2005 showing the average warming compared to a baseline from 1951 to 1980, showing how much of the globe had already warmed more than 1 degree even in 2005, and some parts of the globe had already gone well past the 1.5 degree mark. But the problem, of course, is that it's not just about climate science. A lot of my work has been about disinformation, targeting climate science and climate scientists, but we see these sort of patterns actually in many other areas as well. So you've been talking all day today about the Great Acceleration, so I don't have to explain this slide to you. You know what the Great Acceleration is. We know that the evidence for this is very strong. And we know that the Great Acceleration matters because of the issue of planetary boundaries. And so this is a recent document, recent graph out of the Stockholm Resilience Institute. Again, I'm sure you're all familiar with this, but recently they've declared that as of 2023, 6 of the 9 key planetary boundaries have been passed. So this means that the physical capacity of Earth to supply resources, to absorb pollutants, and crucially to sustain life is not limitless, and in fact is being challenged even as we speak. So if we wish to sustain life on Earth, and I assume that virtually all of us accept that that's a good idea, both the existence of diverse life forms and the quality of human life, we cannot continue business as usual. The scientific evidence of this is overwhelming, and there are very few scientists on this planet who would not agree with that claim. But as I just said, it's not just climate and environmental sciences that get ignored. We fail to act on scientific evidence in many different domains. So just one example, which I've tracked in the United States, scientists have known for decades that being very overweight is very bad for your health. It increases the risk of heart disease, of diabetes, and several forms of cancer, which are leading causes of death in the United States. And I'm focusing here on the US just because that's where I live. But most Americans ignore this evidence. We know the food industry attempts to deny it. And yet we've seen this giant increase in obesity in the United States since 1985. This is from 2001. I don't know what happened to my label there. And then, of course, COVID-19. This is in some ways the most tragic of science denial, because we know that in the United States, 1.1 million people, more than 1.1 million people died directly from the COVID-19 virus. And the number goes up a lot if we look at some of the ancillary deaths Much of this, the Lancet Commission and other scientists who have looked at this have concluded that probably at least 40% of these were preventable, because many of these people died because they refused to get vaccinated. The physician Peter Hotez has a new book that just came out, The Deadly Rise of Anti-Science. He calculates that about 500,000 Americans died because they refused to be vaccinated, even though the evidence of the efficacy and broad safety of the vaccine was clear. So in all these cases, and many more I could talk about if we had more time, knowledge didn't equate to power, in the sense that people, whether as individuals, institutions, or states, did not act on the scientific knowledge. And in general, the response of the scientific community to this has been to produce more scientific knowledge. So the assumption that I think scientists have mostly made, maybe not quite so much now as they did 20 years ago when I first started working in this space, but I think we still see it. The assumption is that people are not acting on scientific knowledge because they aren't aware of it, or they don't understand it, or that the knowledge is not good enough to be persuasive. And so very frequently, scientists try to make more knowledge, or better knowledge, or more persuasive knowledge. And I think we clearly see this in the IPCC. The IPCC, as you know, has been around since 1988. We've now had 6 major assessment reports, plus a whole slew of other special reports. And if we look at the pattern, what has changed in these reports? They've got longer, they're more detailed, they have models that are more elaborate and incorporate much more detail about climate processes. And yet, and as we know, because we've just finished COP28, sit with that, 28 attempts to act on this knowledge, none of which have been at all commensurate with the urgency of the problem as scientists understand. But I don't want to pick on climate scientists. It's not just climate scientists who do this. In biomedicine, we see people who work on vaccines think that the solution is simply to have better studies by having larger sample sizes or longer clinical trials. In psychology, we see pre-registration to ensure or to try to ensure a high level of, quote, objectivity, or in other environmental sciences, being more interdisciplinary, so the science incorporates more perspectives. In other words, more science, better science, different science to solve this problem. In other words, in various ways, the response of scientists is almost always to try to do more or better science. Now, I want to be clear, I'm not against better science. I think better science is definitely a good idea if it can be achieved. But it's not clear that a longer report or a more elaborate climate model is necessarily better. I mean, we have to talk about what we mean by better. But if by better we mean more likely to motivate action, I think the evidence is clear that it doesn't work, or it often doesn't work. And more important, I think that when scientists do this, they're often misdiagnosing the problem. We are assuming that people aren't acting on the science because there isn't enough science, the science isn't good enough, or because people are being emotional and irrational. Now, of course, sometimes people are irrational. No one can deny that. And sometimes we really do need more science. There are certainly cases where the science isn't sufficient to draw firm conclusions. But very often, I think more often than not, people are acting on something. They're not just being irrational. And that something is often some larger way of thinking, some larger intellectual framework, some mental model that is informing their decision making. And so most of my work in recent years, and what I want to talk to you about tonight then, has to do with understanding these frameworks and how they influence our actions. So in the book, Emergence of Doubt, which you just heard about, Eric Conway and I showed that climate change denial really had nothing to do with the quality of climate science or public understanding of that science. Rather, we showed that it was linked to the defense of market-based capitalism, or better, a certain understanding of what market-based capitalism was. The Emergence of Doubt, as you know if you've read the book, didn't just reject climate science, and this was part of the important thing we discovered that needed explanation. I mean, people could have lots of reasons for rejecting a particular science, But what we showed was that these men had rejected the science that demonstrated the harms of tobacco, the harms of the chemicals that caused acid rain, the harms of the chemicals that destroyed the stratosphere ozone hole. And it was this pattern of rejecting science across a broad range of disciplines that made us understand that something else was going on. And what we saw that something else was because to accept the reality and severity of these problems was to admit market failure on a literally global scale. Nicholas Stern, the former chief economist of the World Bank, now a professor at the London School of Economics, has called climate change the greatest and widest ranging market failure ever seen. So what does this mean? It means that if we accept the reality and the severity of climate change, it's to reject what I would argue is the Achilles heel of modern capitalism, the problem that economists call external costs. Costs of economic activity that are not properly accounted for by the so-called free market. And this was the common thread that united these diverse sciences that were challenged by the merchants of doubt, climate change, acid rain, the ozone hole, the harms of tobacco. Excuse me. Because they all identified large external costs of capitalism. In other words, the science wasn't about capitalism. The science was about the atmosphere, the oceans, or public health, and yet what it pointed to were failures of capitalism. So in response, the ideological defenders of capitalism, backed and reinforced by fossil fuel interests, launched disinformation campaigns designed to undermine public understanding of science and therefore to undermine public support for political action. So in our new book, Eric Conway and I pick up this theme. And we follow it back in time. And we ask the question, well, where did these ideas about capitalism come from in the first place? I mean, why shouldn't we acknowledge market failure? Why shouldn't we properly account the external costs of economic activity? I mean, that would be rational, right? And what we show in this new book is how American captains of industry promoted a false narrative, not just about the efficiency and the so-called wisdom of markets, but about their alleged role in protecting political freedom, and use this claim about freedom to try to block government action in the marketplace. So my story today begins with an advertising campaign from the late 1950s and early 1960s. The advertising campaign warned of a grave impending threat to American freedom. So here's one advertisement. How is freedom lost? The ad asked. And this is obviously picture of the Berlin Wall. Excuse me. Sorry. I've clearly been talking too much today. Hopefully my voice will last. Freedom is not lost by guns alone, we were informed. And here was an ad that said, half the world is trying to destroy these four symbols. And what they stand for: freedom of religion, the right to privacy, the right to free expression, and the right to democratic governance. So what were these advertisements for? Anybody know? Oh, thank you. Anybody want to venture a guess?
Radio Free Europe?
Radio Free Europe, that's a good guess. Any other guesses? I'll show you some of the things my students have guessed. Some thought an anti-communist political party, maybe Barry Goldwater, 1960, an anti-communist political group, a religious organization. Any other guesses?
Tobacco industry.
What's that?
The tobacco industry.
Good guess, not quite. It was an industry. The answer is electricity. Specifically, electricity generated in the private sector rather than in the public sector. The argument had two main components. The first was ostensibly a factual claim. It was the claim that government-run or public sector electricity was more expensive than private sector electricity. So therefore, it was not in the interest of the public to have publicly funded or publicly managed electricity projects. So one ad, for example, said, how to save taxpayers $500 million? Don't build federal hydroelectric power projects. But the other half of the argument was ideological. It was that government-run electricity was a threat to freedom. And so if we go back to this advertisement, the advertisement claimed that by intervening in the marketplace, by building hydroelectric dams, the federal government was moving America towards socialism. And so the ad says, every such step leads down the road to socialism. If socialism comes to America this way, step by step, you'll never have a chance to vote against it. For by that time, government will control your job, your independence, your thinking. Then what freedoms will you be able to leave to your children? Some ads show these two themes together, and this is my favorite ad. I love this picture. So on the left, we have electricity coming from a private company represented by a beautiful young woman, and on the right, electricity from the federal government represented by this befuddled-looking man. So it argues that company electricity is superior to government electricity. It's cheaper, it pays taxes, it's available to everyone without discrimination, and plays a key role in America's free enterprise system. Now, these ads were from the 1960s, but they were reprising an argument that had actually been made 40 years before, in the 1920s, by a group called the National Electric Light Association, a trade group representing private electrical utilities. The 1920s NELA propaganda campaign was organized, in the 1920s, NELA organized a propaganda campaign against a particular particular project called Giant Power. Anybody in the room ever heard of this? It's a really, one thing I love about this work is this was a giant debate in the United States about this in the 1920s. It's been completely erased from history, but we're de-erasing it. So, what was Giant Power? Giant Power was a proposal to create a system of integrated statewide electrical power distribution in the state of Pennsylvania. It was the brainchild of two men. One of you've probably heard of, Gifford Pinchot, the governor of Pennsylvania and the first head of the U.S. Forest Service. And the other was Moore Llewellyn Cook, a Taylorist mechanical engineer who later became the head of rural electrification in the New Deal. They were not socialists. Both were, in fact, progressive Republicans affiliated with Teddy Roosevelt, and actually John D. Rockefeller as well. They were advocates of scientific management of natural and industrial resources. So the proposal, which begins in 1923, was to build power plants at coal mines in Pennsylvania to feed the electricity into a statewide grid that would then offer power to all residents at equitable rates. Private companies could still operate, so it's not a state takeover of industry, but they would be forced to contribute the energy into a statewide electricity grid. And crucially, all citizens would be offered power at the same rates. And the state would create a strong regulatory commission to oversee the project. So what was the motivation for this? Why did Pinchot and Llewellyn Cook think we needed this project? Well, Giant Power was primarily a response to market failure. The failure of private electrical utilities to supply electricity to rural customers. Power generation in the United States had been developed primarily as a private sector activity. And this was quite different from many other countries such as Germany, France, New Zealand, Japan, where it had been developed more as a public sector activity. It had been very, very successful in major American cities, such as New York, Chicago, and St. Louis. But rural areas had been largely underserved, and in many cases entirely unserved. And the simple reason was that the profit margins that could be generated in rural areas were just too low. So, for example, in 1925, General Electric, the largest electrical utility in the United States at that time, and still one of the largest companies in America today, put it this way, quote, "The purchasing power of 1.9 million rural people is too low to put them in the potential customer class." Giant Power, though, was also a response to regulatory failure. So electricity in the United States had been recognized as what was referred to as a natural monopoly. That is to say, an area in which competition didn't really make sense because it would be too inefficient to build competing electrical power lines. So the private sector would be allowed to build it as a monopoly, but it would be regulated. And public utility commissions then would set the rates in order to ensure a fair profit, which was normally interpreted to be about a rate of return of, say, 5 to 6%. But there was considerable evidence that the utilities were overcharging, and they were actually getting returns of 7, 8, or even 9%. And they were doing this by cooking the books, by misrepresenting their operating costs, fraudulently misrepresenting costs in order to justify higher rates. And this accusation of fraud then spilled over into a general claim about irregular and dishonest practices. So there was evidence, and journalists at the time wrote a number of exposés about the phenomenon of watering stock, so exaggerating the value of the company to justify issuing more stock and raising more money, bribing local officials, creating holding companies and using them to develop questionable financial arrangements. And many observers noted that although there were regulatory commissions that were supposed to be supervising this, most of them were too weak or too captured to stop it. But the biggest issue was cost. If you compared electricity generated in the United States in places like New York and Pennsylvania by the private sector, the price was higher than in Canada, just across the border, where it was generated as a public good. So advocates of giant power argued that the Canadian experience showed that public electricity could be cheaper and better for consumers. And they wrote reports documenting the fact that Ontario hydropower had brought power to most residents of Ontario, including the rural residents, at a lower cost than the private utilities operating just across the border in New York and Pennsylvania. Oh, sorry. So arguments for public support or public power began to gain support. In response to this, NELA launched a massive propaganda campaign to discredit not just giant power and Gifford Pinchot, but any government role in markets. They did this by denying the facts that proponents of giant power had assembled about costs, corruption, and regulatory failure, but also, and crucially, by promoting the intellectual framework that government involvement in markets was un-American, socialistic, and a threat to freedom. In other words, to shape not just what Americans believed about electricity, but what Americans believed about capitalism. So how did they do this? With a massive, well-financed, multifaceted propaganda campaign. Later in the 1930s, they were investigated by the Federal Trade Commission, who concluded that they had used every means of propaganda except skylighting. They attempted to influence newspapers and other print media, to influence radio, film, and theater. They launched attacks on politicians who supported giant power, particularly Pinchot, but also others. But their largest target was the American educational system. NELA understood that how we evaluate evidence depends heavily on our larger intellectual frameworks and belief structures. And here I believe we can learn from our enemies, because sometimes these people are pretty smart. And in fact, one of the people who they worked with was Edward Bernays, the nephew of Sigmund Freud, who's generally credited with developing peacetime propaganda in the United States and worked extensively for the tobacco industry. So they and a number of other groups who followed worked to build a belief structure that valorized the private sector and discredited the public sector. NELA organized a campaign to alter what was taught in American high school and college economics, civics, and business courses, and thereby to change what Americans knew, quote, knew about capitalism. They did this by funding studies by academics to prove that Ontario hydro wasn't cheaper, and then promoting these studies to the press, who often cited them uncritically, by rewriting textbooks, and by organizing curricula to be more, quote, business-friendly and promote positive, happy views of capitalism. So let's look first at the academic studies. So NELA then began by hiring academics to undertake supposedly independent studies of private versus public generation to prove that the former was cheaper. And we have the documents that show they're saying, we need you, we want you to do a study demonstrating that private electricity is cheaper. Once these studies were completed, then they promoted them through press releases, ghost-written editorials, and letters to editors, bulletins, and sponsored lecture series. Now, they claimed that these authors were independent experts, but in reality, they were all funded by NELA, and most of the press releases and articles about them were written by NELA. They also launched a textbook campaign. NELA officials began by reviewing the major textbooks that were used in American high school civics, college business and economic classes, and identifying a list of textbooks that they considered to be objectionable. Now, what made a textbook objectionable in their view? Well, the NELA claim was that these texts were false, that they were not objective, or that they were socialistic. In reality, and in the book we show some specific examples to support this, anything that cast industry in an unflattering light, particularly books that contain passages discussing industry corruption or unfair business practices, or passages that suggested that people were turning to public electricity because of the failures of the private sector. Once these objectionable texts were identified, NELA then offered money to the authors to write new editions. So they would write to them and say, we love your textbook, but we think it's a little outdated. We'd like to offer you the funds to update it. And if they agreed, then NELA would give them the suggestions for changes, except they weren't really suggestions, they were requirements. If the authors demurred, then NELA found other academics who were willing to write alternative textbooks. Once the new texts were available, NELA sent free copies to schools, colleges, and libraries across the country, encouraging schools to adopt them by pitching them as updated, or, where necessary, pressuring them by insisting that the older texts were biased and socialistic. And again, we have many examples of how this was done, but here's just one. In the state of Missouri, the St. Joe Gas Company paid for copies of the new book to be sent to every single high school in the state. And then they worked to develop pro-market, anti-regulatory curricula at colleges and universities. They offer funds to develop courses and curricula in economic and business administration designed to ensure what they called straight economic thinking, by which they meant free market principles. One of the sad things about this story is we find many academic administrators, particularly deans, welcome the NELA help, enthusiastically accepting NELA money to develop both individual courses, curricula, and even whole departments. And they also, this included leading American business schools, including Harvard. And at Harvard, in the Harvard archives, we actually found the receipts. We found some canceled checks from NELA. So what would constitute success in their view? Well, they wrote, quote, one observer at the time wrote, when judges, lawmakers, members of public utility commissions, prosecuting attorneys, and engineers, in short, all public officials, will be so trained as automatically to oppose genuine regulation, public ownership, honest valuations, equitable rates, etc. Now, as I said, in the 1930s, the FTC investigated NELA and concluded this was the largest peacetime propaganda campaign in US history. And historians agree that it was propaganda, because we can say with confidence that the major claims of NELA were at least misleading, if not false. Private power was more costly. Utilities were overcharging, in part by exaggerating costs. Utilities were a major source of political corruption. And public power was implemented 10 years later as part of the New Deal, and America did not become socialistic. So in some ways, we can say that the propaganda campaign failed. NELA was investigated and discredited. It suffered enormous negative publicity. And as a result of this, the organization disbanded, although it was very soon after reconstituted under a new name, the Edison Electric Institute, which still exists today and has been a significant player in climate change denial. But in other important ways, NELA succeeded. For one thing, giant power was stopped. But more importantly, the NELA propaganda campaign offered a template for what was to follow. So in the book, we document the various ways in which NELA became a template for diverse pro-market anti-government efforts that followed. efforts to deify the free market and demonize what they called, quote, big government. Now, it's a big book. It took a big book to describe a big myth. It's over 500 pages. It is coming out in French shortly, so that is good, end of January. So I don't have time to talk tonight about even a small part of the whole book, but I want to talk about just two aspects that I think are pretty instructive. So the first is another propaganda campaign that followed on the heels of NILA, a campaign by the National Association of Manufacturers. And then I want to jump ahead to the period after World War II, when a group of business executives linked back to the National Association of Manufacturers promoted the work of Friedrich von Hayek in the United States and promoted Milton Friedman, the Chicago School of Economics, and a very particular vision of Adam Smith. So first, let me talk about NAM, the National Association of Manufacturers. So the National Association of Manufacturers in the 1930s was one of America's largest trade organizations, representing factory owners across the country, including major car manufacturers like General Motors, General Electric was part of it, a number of very famous big Fortune 500 companies. In the late 30s, partly in response to the New Deal, they launched a kind of reprise of the NILA propaganda campaign, but even bigger and even larger. They called it a public relations campaign. I'll talk more about that in a minute. And it included a whole variety of things, such as leaflets that were distributed in factories to try to persuade workers not to join unions, a film series that we know reached at least 18 million Americans, a radio program, a fact-based radio program called It's Your Business that had 12 million listeners, a monthly clip sheet of news articles, or ostensibly news articles, that were sent to over 4,600 weekly and 500 daily newspapers around the country. Program Notes, that was a newsletter that was sent to 59,000 women's clubs, a pamphlet series targeted at teachers, billboards plastered across the United States that may have been seen by at least 65 million people. And this is a fun fact. They considered doing a textbook campaign, but one NILA observer said, oh, that might not be a good idea. That didn't really work out so well for NILA, so they didn't do it. Now, in 1933, the population of the United States was 126 million. So these numbers suggest that half of all Americans were likely exposed to the NAM message. And many of these messages were specifically tailored. For example, separate news letters for young people, for women, for teachers, for religious leaders. And in the book, we have some examples of religious leaders using materials they got from NAM in Sunday sermons in their churches. But probably the most important part of this was radio. So today we worry a lot about social media, but in the 1930s, radio was the dominant form of telecommunication in the world. 83% of all American homes had radio, and people listened to radio programs, both factual and dramatic programs. The most important single element of the NAM campaign was a syndicated radio program offered free to stations around the nation called The American Family Robinson. The program was based on the Swiss Family Robinson. You guys know that book, familiar? Yeah, none of my students in America know what this is anymore. But Swiss Family Robinson was a story of a family shipwrecked on a desert island who succeed through hard work and Protestant ethics. So this program is modeled on that, but it takes place instead not on a shipwrecked island, but in a classic American town called Centerville. Each episode had some kind of plot that offered an opportunity for one of the characters to have a monologue or a dialogue arguing against foreign visionary and experimental theories, in other words, socialism and communism, that involved tax increases or government spending. The program was so blatantly anti-Roosevelt that when NAM tried to pitch it to NBC, the largest broadcaster in America at that time, the network refused it, as one script editor reported, because, quote, the definite intention is to conduct propaganda against the New Deal. But despite NBC's turning it down, in fact, nearly 300 independent radio stations across the country broadcast it, and millions of Americans listened to it. but the program was never identified as being linked in any way to NAM. So the viewer would have no way of knowing. And as I started to say before, NAM officials took care always to refer to their activities as, quote, public relations rather than propaganda, even though Edward Bernays was advising them on this, but occasionally they slipped. And so here's a fun memo I found. So one NAM memo asked, can the limitations on the use of radio be overcome so as to make sustaining programs as effective for propaganda as commercial programs have been made for advertising? Now, NAM did face one very serious challenge. It was that their arguments weren't true. In the early 20th century, unregulated capitalism had not brought Americans freedom and prosperity. It had brought them the Gilded Age and the Great Depression. When markets were unregulated in the late 19th century, competition was often replaced by monopoly. And the federal government had passed the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890 to remedy cutthroat competition and monopolistic practices, and as this cartoon suggests, to force corporations, particularly the railroads, to obey the law. This is obviously meant to be Teddy Roosevelt. There was a wide consensus on the need for regulation, so the Sherman Antitrust Act passed the U.S. Senate by a vote of 51-1, and the House of Representatives by a vote of 242-0. Unconstrained private enterprise had also been bad for democracy. Monopolies and trusts had led to vast accumulations of wealth by robber barons, fat cats like this, who were known, it was accepted that they had corrupted both markets and the political system. And if you read the language of the Sherman Antitrust Act or the commentary around it, it's very clear that the act was intended not just to protect competition, but also to protect democracy against corporate concentrations of power and wealth. And of course, American capitalism and European capitalism as well had brought the world the Great Depression. Virtually all commentators agree that unregulated business practices, particularly speculative financial practices, had played a major role in the crash of 1929. People also agree that overproduction in agriculture had contributed to the farm crisis, that farmers' rational pursuit of self-interest had created an irrational farm crisis. So a classic problem of individual self-interest not summing up to something that was good for the whole. And it was not the private sector who pulled the U.S. out of depression. It was the visible hand of government in the form of the New Deal, plus war mobilization, also by the government, that pulled the United States and arguably Europe as well out of the depression. The fact was that unregulated capitalism had produced a world of suffering and hurt. And this was well known to the American people. The early 20th century was characterized by what came to be known as the Progressive Age because of the work of reformers to address the social costs of capitalism. And in the book we have, the first chapter is about the problems of child labor and workmen's compensation, workplace injury, and we begin this conversation with that. So the early 20th century had been characterized by widespread child labor, including children as young as 2 years old working in textile mills in Massachusetts, and commonly advertisements for girls and boys to work in factories. Widespread workplace injury and death, including the famous Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, where 150 women workers were killed, some of whom died by jumping out of windows when the factory caught fire and there was no other way to get out. Brutal corporate violence against workers who tried to organize against poor wages, and also the concept of wage slavery, that people were paid so little that there was no way for workers to ever move from a factory because they couldn't save enough money even to buy a railroad ticket to move to another city or even to move to another part of their own city. So in the face of these facts, Neela's and NAM's response was to reframe the argument to focus not on the successes of private enterprise, but on its allegedly essential role in protecting democracy, in protecting freedom. In 1939, NAM officials concluded, one official concluded, free enterprise will not be saved as the result of appeals in the name of free enterprise alone. Democracy and its preservation are the interest of every patriotic American today. So the public must be convinced that free enterprise is as much an indivisible part of our democracy and the source of as many blessings and benefits as are our other freedoms of speech, press, and religion. NAM staffers believe that if they could emphasize effectively the inseparability of democracy and free enterprise, then enthusiasm and support for the former could carry the latter. And so in December 1939, as war was breaking out in Europe, they launched an initiative that they called the Tripod of Freedom to promote, quote, the American system of free enterprise by insisting it was of one leg of a tripod of freedom whose three legs stood or fell together. In 1939, at their annual meeting, NAM issued this Declaration of Principles. In a world torn by war and dictatorship, Americans live at peace and in freedom. The best assurance that we shall remain free is faith in constitutional representative democracy, in free enterprise, and in civil and religious liberty as inseparable fundamentals of freedom to be cherished and preserved. So NAM would use this metaphor of the tripod of freedom then to insist that any compromise to economic freedom, which is to say business freedom, or sometimes they call it industrial freedom, threatened political and social freedom. So something like a minimum wage law, or a law to restrict child labor by threatening business freedom, threatened political freedom. Sometimes they called it the inseparability of capitalism and freedom, sometimes the indivisibility of freedom. Now, if you're familiar with the history of neoliberalism, these arguments about the inseparability of economic and political freedom will probably be sounding familiar, because it is the central argument made by some of the founders of neoliberalism, particularly Friedrich von Hayek in 1944 in his important work, The Road to Freedom, and then promoted in the United States by Milton Friedman in 1962 in his best-selling book, Capitalism and Freedom. Indeed, it really is, I mean, we could argue about what neoliberalism is, but I think it's fair to say that this is the central argument of modern neoliberalism. And this, we show, is not a coincidence. We have shown that there is a direct historical connection between Ludwig von Mises, who was the founder of the Austrian, or one of the founders of the Austrian School of Economics, and the mentor to Friedrich von Hayek. So between von Mises, von Hayek, and Milton Friedman, and the business conservatives behind the NAM propaganda campaign. In the 1930s, so before the 1939 Declaration of Principles, Hayek's mentor, Ludwig von Mises, was recruited, well, in the 1930s, when he's still in Europe, he served as a paid consultant to the National Association of Manufacturers. And then in the 1940s, a group of businessmen linked to NAM, to the Sun Oil Corporation, and also to the DuPont Corporation, both of whom were part of NAM, brought both von Mises and von Hayek to America. Sorry, it says brought America to America. Well, okay, that's supposed to be Hayek. Okay, they arranged for both of them to be hired at American universities, and they did this behind closed doors. So there was no advertisement for these jobs, no open competition. And I love this irony. These champions of competition did not actually believe in competition when it came to putting the people they wanted in positions of influence. So they arranged for von Mises to be hired at NYU and paid his salary for his entire academic career. Von Mises never actually had a regular job at NYU, but had a visiting professorship paid for by a group of businessmen. And something similar happened at the University of Chicago, where von Hayek was hired over the objections of the economic department, interestingly enough, and a group of businessmen paid his salary as well. Once having brought these European thinkers to the United States, so while in public they're criticizing foreign theories, they're literally importing foreign theorists to America, and then they work to promote their ideas in business circles, in academia, and in American culture. So one example involves The Road to Serfdom. So how many people here have read The Road to Serfdom? Very few. Okay, how many people have heard of it at least? Okay, well, okay, so you should read this book. It's one of the most influential texts of the neoliberal movement in the post-war period. So These businessmen loved this book. They thought it was absolutely fantastic, that it said exactly what they wanted it to say, but they also thought it was too intellectual for an American audience. So they arranged for a Reader's Digest condensed version to be published. And the text was accompanied by a set of commandments of political and economic rights. So this illustration ran adjacent to the text, and you can see it's laid out like the 10 Commandments, but these are commandments of political and economic rights, which articulate the American way of life, and it includes things like the right to freedom from government regulation and control. And then it's all based on a fundamental belief in God. So some economists are cross with me for referring to this as market fundamentalism. They think that's unfair. I don't think it's unfair at all. I think if you look at the iconography of this work, you see that it is tied up in the iconography of Judeo-Christian religiosity. Another example involved a cartoon version of The Road to Serfdom. This was published in 1945 in another mass market magazine, the magazine Look, and it was also reproduced as a pamphlet that was distributed by the General Motors Corporation. So this reduced the entire argument to cartoons, and here, so when Mises and von Hayek's argument is originally situated in the context of Europe, and in what they see as the threat of Soviet-style communism spreading into Europe. And the central argument is about central planning. The idea that if you allow a government to plan the economy the way the Soviet Union is, it's inevitable that that economy will degrade into totalitarianism because of the power that the government has to amass in order to implement central planning. Now that's a complicated and interesting argument. You can argue about whether it's right or wrong, but one of the things that's very interesting about what happens then to this argument in the United States is that it gets resituated in the United States, not about the Soviet threat, but about the threat of communism or dictatorship in the United States associated with the New Deal. So this version starts with national planning during World War II, government mobilization of the economy as part of a war effort, and then it begins 17 cartoons later with a firing squad executing a political dissenter. Now we know from his biographers that Ronald Reagan read The Road to Serfdom, and the evidence suggests that he read the Reader's Digest version. Now, after World War II, there's a bit of a shift in the argument and approach. Away from the overt propaganda of the 20s, 30s, and early 40s, and towards the promotion of a set of ideas that seem to have more intellectual credibility. And this is where the University of Chicago becomes an important part of our story. So we argue that this story does not begin at the University of Chicago the way some people in the past have thought. It actually begins much earlier, but it takes a certain and very important and influential form at the University of Chicago, centered around a particular project there called the Free Market Project. The project was conceptualized by Friedrich von Hayek, working together with a group of business leaders led by a DuPont executive by the name of Jasper Crane, who had been active in NAM, and a man named Harold Lunna, who was the head of a libertarian fund called the Vogler Fund. And this is just a collection of letters between Jasper Crane and Rose Walter Lane, a leading libertarian thinker in the United States and biographer of Herbert Hoover. The concept was to fund an academic program at a prestigious university to develop a blueprint for, quote, an effective competitive system of free enterprise. The project was quite wide-ranging. I don't have time tonight to talk about all of its elements, so I just want to focus on two key famous figures, George Stigler and Milton Friedman, both of whom won the Nobel Prize, the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Science. In 1957, Stigler published an edited version of Adam Smith's classic work, The Wealth of Nations. Now, how many people here have read The Wealth of Nations? Almost no one. Right, because it's one of those famous books that everyone's heard of but no one's read. No, a few people have read it. But if you haven't read it, it's okay. It's 1,000 pages. 1,000 pages of turgid 18th century prose. It's not an easy book to read. And so obviously any 20th century version, particularly a shortened version that you could use in a classroom, would obviously have to leave a lot of things out. But what is conspicuous about this, oh, and I left out one important thing I should have said. The Reader's Digest condensed version of The Road to Serfdom leaves out all the places where von Hayek says, well, of course you do need government for some things. For example, you need government to prevent pollution, deforestation, to ensure safety in workplaces, and to prevent excessive privation through some form of social security or social welfare system. So Hayek was not the ideologue that his American acolytes made him out to be. He was a much more complicated and nuanced figure. And the same thing could be said about Adam Smith. George Stigler left out all the passages in The Wealth of Nations where Smith recognized the limits of self-interest and the need for taxation, regulation, or restraints on self-interest to protect public safety. So, for example, if you've read it, you may know, Smith has an extensive discussion of not just the possibility, but the essential feature of banking regulation, that a capitalist economy cannot operate without banking regulation because, left to their own devices, greedy and reckless bankers will pursue their self-interest in a way that could wreck the entire economy. He also has an extensive discussion of why you need taxation to support public goods, like roads and bridges, why you need minimum wage laws, because left to their own devices, factory workers will pay starvation wages, and why, in turn, workers need to have the right to unionize to counter the power of factory workers. If you read these passages, especially the part about workers unionizing, it's kind of astonishing if you grew up thinking that Adam Smith was
a leftist.
Yeah, right. I mean, right, kind of a leftist. Right, not what most of us were taught about as Adam Smith. Certainly not what most Americans are taught in school. Now, the banking regulation section is particularly interesting because Smith recognizes that some of his readers would object that any regulation was a denial of freedom. And so in response, he offers a succinct summary of when regulation is warranted. And he says, quote, when the natural liberty of a few individuals endangers the security of the whole society. And he argues that that's exactly what reckless bankers do. And so he concludes, the obligation of building party walls, by that he means firewalls, that's like an 18th century term for what today we would call firewalls, in order to prevent the communication of fire, is a violation of natural liberty exactly at the same time with the regulations of the banking trade, which are here proposed. In other words, everyone in England in the 18th century, especially after the Great Fire of London, recognized that building codes that required firewalls was a necessary way to protect public safety, and banking regulation is exactly the same. Jacob Viner, one of the early founders of the Chicago School of Economics before the rise of the free market project, wrote, the modern advocate of laissez-faire, who objects to government participation in business on the grounds that it is an encroachment upon a field reserved by nature for private enterprise, cannot find support for this argument in The Wealth of Nations. So, one more piece of this story, and then I'll try to wrap up. When these business leaders brought Hayek to America, part of the reason they wanted him to come was they wanted him to write an American version of The Road to Serfdom. And there's a set of wonderful letters where they're talking about this, and they say, you know, the communists have Das Kapital, the fascists have Mein Kampf, but we don't have our book. And so we need a book. We need a Bible. Well, they didn't call it this, but I call it the Bible of Market Fundamentalism. We need our text. And so the idea is that Hayek will write an American version of The Road to Serfdom, and this will become the Das Kapital of market fundamentalism. In the end, Hayek doesn't want to do that. He goes back to Europe, but the project is taken up by Milton Friedman, who in 1962 publishes Capitalism and Freedom. And he says in the introduction that his inspiration is von Hayek's Road to Serfdom, and it is, in effect, the blueprint for a system of an American system based on free enterprise. It was funded by the Volcker Fund, the same people who had funded the free market project in the first place. And the central argument is the indivisibility thesis, that economic freedom protects political freedom, and therefore the government needs to be tightly constrained. You need to prevent the government from acting in the marketplace, lest that lead to compromise in political freedom. One of the best summaries of the book I found was written by Leon Kieserling, who was the head of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Harry Truman. He summarized the argument in 1963, quote, freedom is said to depend upon all else, upon limiting the functions of government as closely as possible. And so what Friedman argues for is a very minimalist, very skeletal form of governance where basically the government does nothing other than mobilizing armies, issuing currency, and a few other things. And he has long lists of things he thinks the government should not do, like, for example, fund the social security system. Now, of course, this argument wasn't true either. Just as Stigler's portrayal of Adam Smith was misleading, so was Friedman's picture of history. History offered then and now many examples of situations where capitalism had not protected freedom, many examples of the decoupling of capitalism and freedom. The most obvious one in the United States, of course, was that capitalism did not bring freedom to the 10 million souls who lived under American slavery in the 19th century. It did not bring freedom to the indigenous people whose lands were taken or who were forced onto unproductive reservations. On the contrary, American capitalism stripped them of their freedom and gave their lands to homesteaders. It did not bring freedom to millions of African Americans in the Confederate States who had been emancipated after 1963, only to be subjected to Jim Crow segregation after Reconstruction ended. It did not bring freedom even to free blacks, who, for example, were forbidden from living in Oregon from the 1840s until the passage of the 14th Amendment. And I put this in particular because there's a particularly noxious paragraph in Capitalism Freedom where Friedman says, well, one reason why you shouldn't have federal laws about discrimination is because, you should really leave it to the states, because then if someone doesn't like the state they lived in, they could just move to another state. And this is his answer to discrimination. I'm like, well, yeah, that would be fine if the states hadn't prevented black people from moving there in the 19th century. And of course, neither to women who lacked political and economic rights in most American states until the 20th century, and maybe even lack them today in some American states. And of course, there's a very interesting story about Milton Friedman's views on South Africa. We know that Milton Friedman actually explicitly defended apartheid. In a speech in South Africa in 1976, he argued that rather than fight apartheid, South Africans should simply work to preserve and expand the market-based economy. And that would solve their problems, he argued, because, quote, the economic market provides a greater degree of freedom than the political market. Well, of course, Nelson Mandela and most black South Africans did not agree with that. Friedman's central claim was false. It can be easily shown to be false. And if you read the book, there are all kinds of historical claims. There are some astonishing claims about the history of science and technology that we talk about in the book. But this did not stop his sponsors from promoting these ideas. Friedman became hugely influential. He wrote a regular column for decades for Newsweek magazine. His book became a huge bestseller in part because it was heavily promoted by conservative media. In the 1970s, he started his own television series called Free to Choose, and it was funded by, surprise, surprise, a libertarian businessman, this time a man named Bob Chichester, who supported not just the television series, but, quote, a full-fledged marketing campaign, including a companion book, to explain the benefits of capitalism and political freedom to the world. Now, in the book, we analyze this from a number of perspectives, but because it's getting late, I just want to end by talking about one key piece of our argument, which is that the entire indivisibility thesis rests on a fallacy. And it's the fallacy that philosophers call the fallacy of the excluded middle. That is to say, it's based on a false dichotomy that the only choices we have are unregulated capitalism or absolutely minimally regulated capitalism versus totalitarian dictatorship. And it also reflects on the conflation of politics and economics. The reality I argue, or Eric and I argue in the book, is that democracy is a political system, capitalism is an economic system. And the reality, if you look at the history of the world in the last 300 years, you see a wide range of options as to how countries have mixed and matched the politics and the economics. We've had capitalist countries that were highly undemocratic. We've had more socialist countries that were highly democratic. the point is that we make choices about politics and economics, and those choices are not necessarily strictly coupled. And Europe, of course, is the case in point. Since World War II, the OECD nations, the US, Canada, Australia, Japan, and of course the EU countries have had different mixes of government regulation, levels of taxation, social welfare programs, and protections for labor and the environment, but they all have remained democracies. None of the European countries after World War II that introduced social democracy became socialist, much less totalitarian. Indeed, by many measures, the more regulated social democracies of Europe are more democratic than the United States is today. And numerous studies show that their citizens are happier and healthier than Americans as well. The truth, Eric and I argue, is that freedom is not protected by our forms of distributing goods or services, that is to say, not by our economic system, but by our forms of governance, by our laws, our customs, and our societal norms, which work in part to balance competing interests, because every society, of course, has to grapple with the problem of competing interests. And as the novelist Kim Stanley Robinson has noted, the invisible hand never picks up the check. Thank you very much.
Okay, we have ample time for questions or comments or whatever. I think we only have one mic, so we'll have to share that one. Oh no, we have another one. Okay.
We have another.
Well, thank you very much for the presentation. I will just comment to open this session of questions. Because the presentation was focused on the political and economical, and it was one part was left out, was the part of the industrial processes goes together with the let's say capitalist system, and it's linked with the thermo-industrial way it developed together. So it's just if you can comment on this connection with the technology.
You were saying it's like the rise of capitalism, the rise of industrialization go hand in hand, right?
Capitalism is not the only problem, but also the technology and the energy and the fossil fuels. And
Yeah.
This
Right. Well, I mean, that's a great question, because there's a way in which that part of the question is effaced by a lot of the ideology. So, if you read classic texts by neoliberals or the more propagandist texts by the people we've studied here, they all simply talk about capitalism as if that's the thing that has to be understood and that's the thing that has to be protected. And clearly they're afraid that government regulation will compromise their own self-interest, right? So they use this argument about freedom and this sort of natural linkage between capital and freedom to defend their own self-interest and argue against it. Now, obviously, this is also tied up with industrialization, but in different ways. So in the 19th century, industrialization did create pollution, but that wasn't really the focus of most people's objections, right? Most of the objections to capitalism in the 19th century had to do with the exploitation of labor, and that's why Marx is so focused on that and pays very little attention to problems of pollution, even though they were already becoming pretty evident, and Engels does talk about it a little bit, right? But it's not his main focus, because the main people see it as grotesque exploitation of labor, horrible working conditions, starvation of wages, widespread child labor. And so that becomes the focus of reformers, who then in the 20th century put in place, I mean, our book focuses on the United States, but we see also in Germany and England and France, reforms to limit child labor, reforms to improve the conditions of the working classes, the development of healthcare networks. So then things shift in the 20th century with the rise of recognition of industrially driven pollution and environmental damage. And I think that's part of the story of why science becomes a target in this later period. Because if you look at the early period, science is not a target. Very rarely. I mean, occasionally you'll see someone criticizing some scientific claim, but it's very, very rare. I mean, in general, the industrialists are pro-science because they see science as supporting industrial processes, particularly chemistry, for example, is hugely important for the chemical industry. and they support research. They give money for research in chemistry. They give money for electrical engineering programs. But it's only after, really around the 1970s, I would say, when science begins to document these emerging global environmental problems associated with air pollution, water pollution, pesticides, later endocrine disrupting chemicals. That's when we begin to see science now and attacks on science. And so, you know, the story shifts a bit in terms of what becomes the target based on, you know, how the technology and the industrialization is evolving. So technology industrialization is definitely part of the story and helps to explain some of the changes that we see over time.
Yes, thank you very much. You mentioned that the textbook campaign of Nila backfired in public relations terms, and as a high school teacher, former high school teacher, it made me think of a more recent thing that was similar, which was the Arunyaya book on creationism that was also printed, and a creationism propaganda book that was also sent. I know it backfired quite well here in Europe, but how was that received in the US?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't really know how that particular book was received. I mean, and when I say the Nila campaign backfired, in a way, maybe that's too strong, because one of the things we've not been able to establish is, so they distributed all these textbooks, but what happened to all those textbooks, right? Did those schools get rid of them? I'm guessing probably not. All those libraries, did they get rid of those books and go back to the ones they had before? Almost certainly not, because they probably would have discarded and deaccessioned those other books. So, you know, once these books are in circulation, they can continue to have effects, even if, you know, officially Nila has been, quote, discredited. So with the creationism, I don't know about that particular book. I think the book that got the most attention in the United States was this textbook called Of Pandas and People. Do you know about that? And this was a book that played a large role in the legal case in Dover, Pennsylvania, where some parents sued the school board because they were giving equal time to creationism. And it turned out the textbook they were using had been developed by the Discovery Institute, which is a creationist organization in the United States. And they had taken a previous textbook that was a creationist textbook, explicitly creationist, and they had done a global search and replace the word creationism with intelligent design in order to claim that this was a scientific theory, because intelligent design is a scientific theory, and therefore that it could be taught and it would pass the standards of what constituted appropriate science thing. Except when they did it, they messed up. And so in a few places, the word creationism was not entirely erased, so it said create intelligent designism. And this was presented in court to prove that this textbook was actually a creationist textbook repackaged, and this played a major role in discrediting both the textbook itself, but also the school board that had tried to use it in a science classroom. And as I always tell my students, this is why you have to read carefully, because everyone makes mistakes, and sometimes you only find the mistakes when you read carefully, and sometimes they can be very informative.
Thank you for your interesting view on Milton Friedman in the School of Chicago, etc. But I was expecting something else, and you started your talk with what prevents us from acting on scientific knowledge, and then the story comes, and then the second thing is the title was Science, Scientists, and the Great Acceleration, and I can't see the link.
Ah, okay. Well, I think that you gave me the title. I don't know where that title came from. So that's my excuse. I was working with a title that I don't know where it came from. Well, I think the point I'm trying to make is, and I guess it's left implicit at the end of the talk, so let me make it explicit. So why do so many Americans, I mean, again, we focus particularly in the United States, but I think this also applies in many quarters in Europe. Why have we been so reluctant to accept the scientific evidence of the Great Acceleration? the scientific evidence of planetary boundaries, especially the planetary boundaries. I mean, if that work is correct, we should all be terrified, and we should all be, every parliament in Europe, every member of Congress in the United States, every government on the planet should be acting extraordinarily briskly to respond to this imminent threat to the future of life on Earth. But that's not happening. So why is it not happening? And I think it's obviously a very complicated question. It's obviously overdetermined. It's not just one thing, but certainly in the United States, I think a big part of it is faith in markets to solve the problem. And we see repeatedly business leaders, conservative politicians saying, oh, don't worry, technology will solve the problem. Like in the book, we have a quotation from the Wall Street Journal, where the Wall Street Journal explicitly says, the problem of climate change will be solved by technological innovation in a free market, right? So it gets back to the industrialization. Just leave it to the marketplace will solve our problems. And so it's all tied up with this ideology of the wisdom, the magic, the efficacy, the efficiency of markets. And so our argument is that commitment to that mental model, the idea that markets solve our problem and that governments are inefficient and that any government solution is likely to be, the cure will be worse than the disease. Again, you'll see that in a lot of business publications, that stands in the way of acting on the science.
Any questions? So first of all, thanks a lot for a wonderful talk and very, very convincing. I fully agree, of course, that the association between democracy and capitalism is not right. In fact, in my introductory economics class, I like to say that democracy is supposed to be one person, one vote, and shareholder capitalism is $1, one vote. And so
Yes.
the more inequality, the bigger the threat to democracy. Now, beyond this, I think what you showed very well, in a sense, is the Marxian idea that infrastructure determines superstructure.
Mm-hmm.
So economic interests determine which kind of thinkers have success. Now, of course, I mean, you're fully right. In the US, since Reagan, it has been a lot of Hayek and Friedman. Of course, when they were writing their stuff, it was Keynes.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And Keynes, by the way, was a member of the Liberal Party.
Yes.
And he was trying to avoid, let's say, centrally planned socialism and fascism.
Mm-hmm.
But then he, of course, writing after the Great Depression, he pushed for state intervention, and today it's surrounding on the left.
Mm-hmm.
While, of course, it's the 70s, with all the stagflation and the like, that led to Reagan. But maybe coming to the link between all this and climate change, I mean, clearly the fossil fuel industry has used market fundamentalism. Now, if I want to provoke you a little bit, I, as a left of center, we call this socialist in Belgium, I don't like the politics of Elon Musk. But Elon Musk can be a part of the solution to a climate change problem rather than the problem. So in a sense, is there a kind of a disconnect between the ability to solve climate change, thanks to carbon taxes and also subsidies or whatever, or is capitalism to be eliminated in order to succeed?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. And at the end of the book, we deliberately avoid it because it's such a giant question and hard to do justice to unless we wrote a whole separate book about it, which perhaps we will. But I just want to say, first of all, I completely agree with what you said about $1, one vote. And we actually say that in the book, right? The whole problem with Milton Friedman's argument about the marketplace being a kind of voting booth, right? I mean, he made that argument. It was picked up by, I forget, one of an earlier CEO of Chase Manhattan Bank. In the marketplace, whoever has the most money has the most votes, right? And we see that clearly in so many aspects of global society where the wealthy have more say than the poor and the working class. So there's no question that that's a super important part of this issue. And so that's where questions of policy, taxation, and I think come to the fore. And I think it's not a coincidence that one of the things these people are arguing for is minimal regulation of their businesses, but they also argue very, very strongly against taxation, including, if we go back to the 1920s, the progressive income tax in the United States. Because the reality is, and I mean, this is Thomas Piketty's whole argument, that if you allow when capitalism does its thing, it leads to enormous accumulations of wealth. And so you have to have something in the system to redress that. And so progressive taxation is one way that you can remedy that. And that was done both in Europe and the United States after World War II. One thing I sometimes talk about in America that causes my American audiences to gasp is that the marginal tax rate in the United States under Dwight Eisenhower, a Republican, was 92%. That's like Sweden. But that was rolled back beginning with Ronald Reagan and ever since, right? And so we've seen this aggressive attack on progressive taxation, which then gets attacked as socialistic in the United States, redistributed. The right wing has a whole mantra now about taxation being theft, as opposed to taxation being an appropriate corrective. Yeah. So if we look at capitalism, I think the jury is out. What I would like to argue is that capitalism isn't just one thing any more than religion is one thing or the state is one thing. There have been different forms of capitalism, and that a lot of the environmental problems that have developed in our lifetimes relate back to the question about industrialization, has to do with the environmental impacts of certain kinds of industrialization since World War II and the Great Acceleration. It's related to that because, if you look at pollution, population, resource use, right, you see they're going more or less linearly in terms of growth until 1945. And then there's this sudden exponential growth. And it's that sudden exponential growth which then puts us into the space where we're up against planetary limits. So what is that about? Is that something different about post-war capitalism? Is it about population growth? Is it about something about changing expectations related to consumption? I think there's a whole set of questions there that we haven't answered, but it's at least plausible to say that the problem is the particular form of globalized, financialized, and weakly regulated capitalism that has prevailed for the last 40 years. And so to say one more thing, if we come back to the idea of a carbon tax, I don't think a carbon tax by itself would solve all of our problems, but I think it would solve a lot of them because, again, if you think about Elon Musk, he's built a good car, and lots of people like that car. And if you can afford it, you might buy it. And many people, including Eric Conway, own Teslas. But the vast majority of Americans can't afford that car, right? And it's been very interesting to see how in the car market in the United States, most of the market has focused on the high-end cars. So there's a whole set of beautiful luxury electric vehicles now available, and they all cost huge amounts of money. But if we had a carbon tax, or if we had a stronger system of tax credits for low-price electric cars, you could shift that, right? And we know the government can do a lot to shift patterns of consumption, incentives for the private sector, and we haven't even begun to really exploit all of those tools. So my view is, it may be that in the fullness of time, we'll do something very different. And in fact, I think as a historian, you'd have to say, of course, eventually we'll have a different system. I mean, we don't have feudalism anymore. We don't have mercantilism. It's not really plausible to think we'll have capitalism forever. But at least for now, it seems to me, the safer bet is not to say I want a revolution, because they don't always go very well, but to say there are these tools at our disposal, proven tools, like taxation and various forms of incentives, that could make a big difference. The problem now, though, is we're running out of time. And so, to me, one of the ironies of this story is because we've lost so much time because of denial and disinformation, now we are looking at having to have more coercive forms of governments to fix this because the time frame is shorter.
Hi, good evening. Thank you very much for your presentation, and not only for your presentation, but also for your work that in Europe has been very helpful also to expose lobby tactics of the agrochemical industry and biotech industry, which I'm following myself. So thank you very much for that. Maybe more a tactical question. So in your talk tonight, you talk about what prevents us from acting, and that the common answer would be to make more knowledge or seeking to make more persuasive knowledge, but that's not the answer. The answer is more democracy. I get you right. But then, so a lot of that is like is very slow. Like in the moment, you also mentioned there is like a lot of false claims that are made that do a lot of harm. So have you seen good examples, or what is your answer to how to respond to false claims in the short term?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I do have some thoughts on that, some examples. So one thing we know, and there's a fair amount of social science research on this now, if people are facing false claims and you simply supply them with true claims or good information, if you don't want to use true and false, it doesn't really work, because now they're just confused. So they're hearing, well, you say this, they say that, I don't know what to think. But if you explain to people that the false information is disinformation, and you explain to them who's doing it and why, that can be very powerful. So John Cook has done work on this. He calls it inoculation, that you can actually inoculate people against disinformation. And there's evidence that this can be effective. And I found it in my own work. One of the things I've seen when I give public talks, when you expose disinformation as disinformation, people's emotional response to it is different than if you just give them more science. Because the way I think of it is, no one wants to be a sucker. No one wants to be, the guy who's at the losing end of the con game. Nobody wants to be the victim of a show. And so when you frame it that way and say, look, the fossil fuel industry is taking you for a ride, they're making you into a sucker. And do you really want to be a sucker? That I have found, particularly in the United States, it might be different here, but I found that can be quite effective. And so I've been in places where I've given talks to skeptical audiences. By the end of the evening, felt like, okay, my audience is more with me than they were an hour ago, because they didn't understand that this was disinformation, and now they do.
Yeah. I have something, I don't know if it's a question or a remark or something else, but what we saw in what you presented, and what we all know, of course, especially in the US, where things are a bit different from here, is the capitalistic system was throughout so many decades promoted by using the dichotomy that you told about, so the socialist threat, which, trying to put myself into the shoes or the skin of somebody living in the US, is something that you can relate to. You can be influenced by it in the 20s, in the 30s, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, but then in 89 something happens. Mm-hmm. And so that dichotomy should be about to wear off. Mm-hmm. But you see that it's still there. You also see that it becomes more complicated. The dichotomy becomes, it's not only socialist, it's also this more complex view, like this big brother thing, which is of course linked to socialism, but everybody knows that socialism is not alive in so many countries anymore, so it becomes something else. But so my question is kind of, how is it possible that the socialist threat or the socialist idea is still so much alive? That's one thing. When's it going to wear off? But the other thing is it still this threat, or is it turning into something else that is, I don't know, being created, some new dichotomy, and what would that be?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. So the socialist threat is still alive and well. Still alive and well and being used as a boogeyman in the United States. So it is astonishing to me how often you will see right-wing propaganda. Particularly, I subscribe to a bunch of right-wing newsletters and emails chains, so I can see what they're telling their people. Because you won't see this like in mass media, but you will see this in the communications that are designed, for rallying the troops. And they're filled with claims that Joe Biden is a socialist, that there's still a liberal conspiracy to bring socialism to America. I mean, it is amazing how that trope persists even today, when you might argue there is no serious socialist threat. But you could also argue there was never really a serious socialist threat in America. I mean, not really. But that connects to your question about 1989. So the right wing in the United States has always used socialism and communism interchangeably, and that's also part of the propaganda tactic, right? To deny that there's any difference, to conflate actually three things: social democracy, socialism, and communism, and to say they're all the same, which then makes it hard for the opponents to say, wait, hold on, I'm not a communist, but I am a socialist. Or I'm not a socialist, but I am a social democracy. Makes that conversation very difficult. What happens in 1989, though, I think is fascinating. So you might have thought that with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the communist boogeyman would fade, that we wouldn't be worried about that anymore, and we would have the opportunity to focus on other more productive issues. But what happens on the right in America is the collapse of the Soviet Union is used as justification to say, and particularly for folks, some of the kinds of people I study, to say, see, we were right. Communism is no good. It's not just that it's totalitarian and horrible, but actually it fails economically as well. It's a complete failure both economically and politically. And so you see the right wing become emboldened by this. And you see more aggressive language being used after 1989, basically to argue that the Cold War, the end of the Cold War, proved that capitalism was the superior system. And therefore, if capitalism is the superior system, the best form of capitalism is the purest form. And so this becomes used as an argument to weaken regulation, to say, oh, banking regulation, yeah, we've been too strict about that. Let's loosen that. And some people who have studied this have argued that it also influences American foreign policy. Because as long as there's a Soviet threat, America is sensitive about how we're viewed by post-colonial nations. And there's a sense that we can't be too brutal, or else, post-colonial nations will say, yeah, we don't want that. But after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there's a sense among some people, well, now the world sees there's no alternative, right? This is the Margaret Thatcher line, Tina, there's no alternative, right? The only alternative is capitalism, and the best version of capitalism is the unregulated or deregulated version. And so, ironically, the loss of the Soviet threat actually makes people feel they can push for a more aggressive, more brutal form of capitalism. I think that's what we see in the United States.
Thank you very much for this very inspiring talk. I think it was really enjoyable. I'm working myself in science industry relations and history, and I think it was fascinating. It's really reminiscent of many fantastic works also, and Malm, and I think Thomas Hughes also in the first part. I think.
Yes.
Anyway.
Yeah. Thank you. Very few people see the connection to Thomas Hughes, but that's very important. Actually, thank you.
I just have, in fact, a couple of fun facts I'd like to give to you about this university and the connection with it. The first one is in fact, 100 years ago, exactly, the first building which was created here on this campus was a building called the U building, bâtiment public French. And it was a building for engineers and physicists. And interestingly, it was built with the initiative of engineers and physicists and everything. And they really wanted to have a space. It was a private endowment and everything. And the first idea was, it was a massive drive of private funding. And they wanted labs organized also and possibly hosted by private companies. And the first company which really wanted to have this R&D lab on site here at the university was the Edison company. So that's maybe a little fun fact, because in a way it was driven by the Telluride group of engineers here at the ULB, but also in coordination with the Edison company in a way. But the other fun fact is even more interesting, I think. The second building was built the year after, the A building, Bâtiment A, which was even larger and also a massive drive, organized by two guys, mainly a Belgian banker, whose name is Émile Franqui, at the time of the Société Générale, very powerful holding company also. and an American engineer who later became president of the US, Herbert Hoover.
Oh, because he spent a lot of time in Belgium.
And he really wanted to choose the ULB, the Libre de Bruxelles, also because of this, I would say, because it was epitomizing in a way the idea of freedom and liberty, also of free state and free capitalism.
Yeah.
So that's interesting to see that after all, in spite of all what you say, but well, this is a university which really exemplified its history. I would say the truth and the values of freedom in a way, with all the irony. But anyway, I think this is really fascinating and a lot of I think information I would like to share with my students afterwards. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for that. And just a quick note about Herbert Hoover. So we talk about him in the book. He's obviously a very important figure in this book. And to me, he's a kind of tragic figure because in a way, he represents the incapacity of many people to get past their own mental models, right? So many people greatly admired him after World War I for the work he did on famine relief. And he was considered a quite popular figure in the United States. And this is partly how he gets to be elected president, because people see him as this very effective, intelligent person, effective manager, and humanitarian. But then the Great Depression hits, and he just can't get past his vision of, volunteerism, individualism. We don't need the government to fix this. The private sector will step up to the plate. And he implores business leaders in the United States, including people he knows personally, to do more, to figure out how to a way to get people back to work. And it doesn't work. And, so this leads him to say, his famous line about prosperity being just around the corner. There's a famous cartoon in America where a bunch of, people out of work are looking like, now which corner exactly is that, right? So he becomes discredited. And you might think that given that, he would realize that, volunteerism, individualism, private charity are just not up to the task. But instead, he goes the other way. He digs in. And in 1934, he writes a book called The Challenge to Liberty. And that is the book that actually inspires the NAM campaign that I talked about tonight. So thank you for that detail.
And the last irony is that the building, which I was talking about, funded partly by Hoover after the Second World War, well, the street in front was renamed after Roosevelt.
Well, that's just. I don't think we can hear you. No, still not.
C'est vers le haut. Le bouton vers le haut. Sauf s'il est vide.
Il est un peu usé.
Maintenant, ça a marché.
Ça a marché?
Ah, there you go.
As you know, I'm a question and I know close to nothing, if not nothing, to economy. So please forgive my the simplicity of my questions. But I've basically two questions. One is that I'm surprised to hear this discussion about socialism against capitalism, which I thought was totally out of date, or totally outdated. And my feeling was that the debate would be more relevant in terms of growth versus degrowth. And my final question is the following. Do you think that, what is your opinion about capitalism being the problem behind climate change? And would, in that perspective, degrowth be true to it or not?
Well, thanks for that question. And this gets back to your question as well. So I think the question of whether capitalism is responsible for climate change is just a very difficult one, because you could imagine, if you look at, say, the Soviet Union, they produced tremendous industrial pollution as well. It's not as if the communist nations were, not polluting or not using resources. And, we have some really appalling examples in environmental pollution in the former Soviet Union. China today is rushing forward, with massive use of fossil fuels and other materials. What is China today? I don't know. Some economists call it market authoritarianism. It's very complicated. So I don't think that you can simply say that climate change is caused by capitalism. I think you could say it's caused by industrialization or industrialization under capitalism in an inadequately regulated market where we don't account for the external costs. And so the way I think about it, and this is a giant question, it's not something that I think we can solve tonight. We actually originally thought in the book that we would have a final chapter dealing with this and talking about different visions of capitalism or different forms of capitalism. And then when we started looking into it, we thought, oh, that's a whole other book, And so we just thought that we just can't do that here. But, I would like to, so we started thinking about, well, is there even a name for the sort of thing that we think we need? And we played around with, and if anybody knows anybody who's actually done work in this, please let me know. But what I would call full accounting capitalism, we have a form of accounting where we don't account for the external costs. And your example, I think, is a brilliant one. So if I may share it with the rest of the audience. So these are astronomers who are concerned about the way in which the growth of commercial satellites is threatening the capacity of astronomers to see the night sky, because Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and others are planning to put tens of thousands of satellites into low Earth orbit. Correct me if I say anything wrong. With no regulation, no control, no international governance. And this threatens both the capacity of astronomers to do observational astronomy, but also potentially there's so much space debris now in space, potentially threatening even the possibility of space exploration if the lower atmosphere becomes so cluttered with space junk that you can't even get a spaceship through it. And also the third thing we talked about this afternoon was also the risk that if an asteroid were to be coming towards the Earth in a way that could collide with Earth and destroy us, the don't look up scenario, that we would not be able to see it because of the visual pollution of all these satellites. So this is a classic case of external costs, right? Here's the free market. Elon Musk isn't breaking the law. Jeff Bezos isn't breaking the law. He's not violating an international convention on the night sky because there is no law that covers this. So this is the free market, right? This is an entrepreneur doing all the disruptive things that Silicon Valley tell us they should do, that this is good. And yet we see this potentially giant external cost, so giant that it could even be worse than climate change, right? It could be the total destruction of life on Earth. And yet we seem to be powerless to do anything about it. You were saying you found it hard even to get people's attention for the issue, much less to figure out the solution. So I think this is a really good example of how the free market as currently understood is not free at all. It has these giant costs that we don't account for. So what is the solution to that? I don't know. Is it degrowth? Maybe. One of the things that's interesting, it's always been interesting for me because I've spent lots of time in Europe. The conversations in Europe are often quite different than they are in the United States. In the US, almost nobody is talking about degrowth. Almost nobody takes it seriously, even in academia. Whereas here, obviously, people do, and there's lots of books that have been written about it. Maybe the economists can help us. It's something I don't understand. I don't understand why we can't conceptualize a steady state economy. It seems like we should be able to. Organisms reach a point where they stop growing, and that's a good thing, right? So in other areas of life, we recognize the notion of steady state, but we don't seem to be able to conceptualize, well, Herman Daly tried, but he never became mainstream. What would it really look like to have a steady state economy? Right now, every economist, or virtually every economist, if you say, oh, I'd like to see degrowth, they'll tell you that's called a depression, right? So I don't know how you get around that, and I don't know enough economics to know what the argument would be that would be persuasive to economists. So that's the best I can do with that for now. I do have a stack of books this high about alternative capitalism. So that's like on my to-do read list now that this book is done. And now I'll probably come up with some great idea for what that final chapter could have been. So. And I should say almost all the books on alternative capitalism have been written by Europeans.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Going to the start, there is something that clicked that you said. It was that the natural reaction to scientists not being believed is to produce more knowledge. And if I have to look back at my learning classes and my learning years at universities, it seems supernatural because there was never a class or a teacher telling me what to do or just saying there is a possibility that what you are going to hear might be controversial or contradicted or stuff like that. And even right now, as a working scientist, my main goal is to publish something and to be accepted. And if it's not accepted by the scientific community, the only response is to produce another, better, or different knowledge.
Right.
So I guess my question is, do you think that as a university, as a teaching institution, we should have to adapt some stuff to introduce some courses on those matters inside scientific lessons, etc.?
Well, yes, obviously the answer is yes, I do. I don't think that scientists need to become sociologists or historians or philosophers or political scientists, but I do think it would help matters quite a bit if all scientists had at least a little training, some exposure to history, philosophy, sociology of science, social studies of science, in order to better understand how science operates in society and how scientific knowledge is or isn't used, whether how it's taken up or not. And I think even a small amount of training in that area would help scientists, particularly scientists who actually would like to be involved in public debate. Because if you just want to do, your physics or your astronomy or your chemistry, I think that's fine. I don't think every scientist needs to become a public intellectual or an activist. But for those who want to be engaged, I've seen many cases where scientists try to engage and they do it badly, sometimes even ways that could make the problem worse because they don't understand the social landscape in which they're operating. And sometimes they say things that are offensive to their audiences for this reason, right? And often innocently, they're not intending to offend the audience, but they do because they don't understand the social landscape. So I do think that some degree of training would be very helpful. And then also as a scientist, you could decide, you might decide, look, I'm good at science, that's what I do, that's what I know how to do, that's what I want to do. And I think that's fine. But for those scientists who say, well, that's not quite enough, I would like to see my work have more influence or be taken up or be able to reach out more to broader publics or to policymakers, then to have the toolkits to do that. Because even at the IPCC, you might think after all these years and all the interfaces that the IPCC has had, that they have a very clear idea now of what work they need to do to influence policy. And I think some people at the IPCC have definitely, there's definitely conversations taking place there that didn't happen 10 years ago. But, there's still a tremendous amount of, the view still prevails among, I think, the majority of scientists involved in the IPCC that they just need to keep doing more science, more working group one reports, more uncertainty quantification, right? One of the most astonishing scientific meetings I was ever at was when Steve Schneider died. There was a big conference in his honor. So this is one of the most famous climate scientists who ever lived, and a scientist who had been involved in policy and had done a lot of work to try to educate himself, like about how economists thought. He actually attended economics classes, went back to school. Not formally, but and one of the scientists there said, they were talking about the failure of the world to act on climate change, and she said, well, if we could just get the error bars narrowed, right? Like the idea that what was stopping the world from acting was that the uncertainties were too great. So we just narrow the uncertainties, everything would fall into place. And I remember seeing it thinking, right? And this was a prominent person, very active in the IPCC, and a friend of Steve Schneider. And yet she still had this mental model that the problem was too much uncertainty.
Thank you for a fascinating talk. Sort of building on that, really, I was going to ask, what should scientists do now? But perhaps more broadly, if more science isn't the answer, and with the world's biggest issues, we know the problem very well, and we know the solutions pretty much very well. So we've got this situation, as you say, where knowledge is power. And maybe this is like the million-dollar question, but how do we overcome that? What should we be doing? What should universities be doing? What should scientists be doing?
Well, I do think that universities should be putting a lot more money into the social sciences and the arts and humanities. I mean, one thing that's sad to me, watching how universities have evolved in the United States in my lifetime, including at Harvard, I mean, it's been almost a tragedy to me to see how the response of so many university leaders is say, oh, we need more science. What? Hello? Yeah, it's like, is that really the lesson that you take from this? But that's what we see over and over again. And there are big economic incentives for that. I mean, particularly at Harvard, we're seeing the administration just doing huge amounts to cultivate private sector donors who are interested in supporting science and engineering, and not doing the work that it seems to me a university leader could be doing to persuade donors. I mean, a lot of donors just want to put their name on something. They don't necessarily have strong views about what it's going to support. I mean, the big donation from Ken Griffith to Harvard is proof of this, right? He donated $200 million, and he did not specify what that money was for. But they renamed the graduate school after him because there was nothing else left to rename. Well, there was the law school and business school, but I think it would take more than $200 million to buy the Harvard Law School. So the point is, I mean, the university could have sat down with him and said, you know, what we really need is not more money for more engineering. What we really need is a new program to think about these questions about why scientific knowledge doesn't get the uptake that we think it deserves. But I have not seen that kind of leadership. Well, yeah, I don't want to say that. I don't want to bite the hand that feeds me. But, you know, in general, we don't see that happening, right? And so I think that's, you know, a giant missed opportunity. And I guess the other thing I think, which maybe gets back to your question, I think in my experience, a lot of scientists do want their work to have social impact. They do want their work to be meaningful, but they don't know how, right? And so I think we could think about developing programs to look at that question and say, well, what is it that natural scientists or social scientists could do to help them see that their work has more impact? And that could actually be a really interesting area of research and education. And I would love to see that happen in universities around the world.
Okay, thanks. I am a little bit frustrated because I have prepared specifically 2 questions.
Oh, well, do we have time?
They took the time away.
No, well, we can, yeah.
So we have to close down. Thanks to you. I think it's really, as many of the audience said, it's fascinating what you do. So I think it's really a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.
And I would also thank all the people who stayed here and who will go with us to the drink. So the drink is not here, but it's in the adjacent building in the drink offered by the faculty as it is tradition for these occasions. And we will continue the discussion in a different room tomorrow morning from 10 to 12. So for those who are interested, it's still around the bulk of the myth building, the economic myth building, and there will be a Paris scholar coming over also, illuminating our sights on the European economic myth building, because there's quite some myth building also in Europe.
Yes.
Maastricht criteria, you know, all these things, they are sort of constructed to a certain extent. So, but for now I close it for tonight. Many thanks for all of you, and take care.
Thank you.